Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Cully Foster, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to our Foreign Policy Panel Series, There's Something About Russia. We're going to find out tonight what that something is. Many thanks to our strategic partners at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center for their wonderful hospitality and kindness in providing us with a beautiful venue to hold our public programs. Today's event will focus on Russia, its history, and its motivations for policy in the global sphere. Some background information. For almost 400 years, Russia was ruled by a series of Tsars. They fought to expand the Russian Empire to the east towards the Pacific Ocean, to the south towards the Black Sea, seeking a warm water port from which they could conduct international trade. This ended abruptly with the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, and the murder of the last Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918. For the majority of the 20th century, the newly established Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as the Beatles sang, in the USSR, would rule in place of the Russian Empire. Following the heavy losses sustained in the Second World War, the Soviet Union rose to prominence as a nuclear power and proceeded to internationally compete with the United States in both the military and scientific fields during the Cold War. Due to increasing economic strain and political unrest, the Soviet Union instituted the policies of perestroika and glasnost, meaning restructuring and openness. These reforms began to hasten the collapse of the USSR in 1989. It was officially dissolved after a series of treaties signed by the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991. This resulted in the establishment of the Russian Federation, which was recognized by international law as the legal successor state to the Soviet Union. In 1999, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, became the acting president of Russia. He continued to serve 2 terms as the elected president from 2000 to 2008. In 2008, Russia invaded the pro-West nation of Georgia due to border disputes between Russian separatist states of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It marked Abkhazia. There you go. It marked the first time that cyber warfare was used in coordination with physical military strikes. These tactics were seen again in Ukraine in 2014 in the aftermath of the Euromaidan protests that saw the resignation of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. In the elections that followed, Russia once again utilized cyber warfare along with asymmetrical warfare to destabilize Ukraine's democratic process. Russia is currently a nation with a population of 142 million, with a diverse religious makeup, 20% Orthodox Christians, 15% Islam, 45 to 50% claiming that they are atheist or agnostic. Russia is host to over 200 ethnic groups, the most prominent being Russian, 78%, Tatar, 4%, Ukrainian, 1.5%, and others. With the GDP of $1.268 trillion, Russia's economy is driven principally by oil, natural gas, and natural resources. Russia has proceeded to use its success, access to strategic resources to great effect, oftentimes threatening to shut down gas pipelines to the European Union. Russia also has been expanding its defense and shipbuilding sectors in order to compete with Western nations. Tensions between the United States and Russia have carried over and have even intensified since the Cold War. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the word Ukraine means beyond the frontier in Russia, and the annexation of Crimea, the United States has suspended most of its bilateral engagements with the Russian Federation. In 2014, the US and the G7 decided to suspend Russia's membership in the G8 and impose economic sanctions on the Russian economy. The fall of oil prices in 2015 led to a sharp recession in the Russian economy, threatening to bring it to the brink of collapse. NATO remains a crucial point of contention as it continues to expand, operating beyond the confines of the Atlantic Ocean. So much so that Russia has taken effective steps to prevent nations like Ukraine and Georgia from joining NATO. So here's two questions. What are Russia's motivations? What influences its policy decisions? To help us better understand this situation, we are fortunate to have a panel of experts with us tonight. Our panelists are Hannah Thoburn. Hannah is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she specializes in Eastern European relations, with a concentration on Russian and Ukrainian relations. She writes for the World Affairs Journal blog, Eurasia Uncovered, and has written several pieces on US-Russian relations. Ms. Thoburn earned her master's degree from Yale University in International Relations and International Security Studies. Dr. William Pomeranz. Dr. Pomeranz serves as the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. He is also a professor at Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies. Dr. Pomeranz served as a lawyer practicing international law between the United States and Russia. He's also worked with the National Endowment for Democracy from 1992 to 1999 as the program officer for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Dr. Pomeranz received his PhD in Russian history from the University of London and his JD from American University. Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff. Dr. Mankoff is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to his work with CSIS, Dr. Mankoff worked as an advisor on Russia-US relations at the US Department of State and as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. He received his doctoral degree from Yale and is a former fellow of Yale, Harvard, and Moscow State Universities, and is also the author of the book Russian Foreign Policy, The Return of Great Power Politics. Anna Gawel, moderator. Our moderator for this evening, Anna, is the managing editor of one of our big strategic partners at the World Affairs Council, the Washington Diplomat, whose founder is with us here tonight, my friend Victor Shibley. Anna is the news columnist for the Diplomatic Pouch. Before working with the Washington Diplomat, Mrs. Gawel was a morning news assistant at WMAL Radio and a production assistant at PBS for the political commentary TV program, To the Contrary. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panels and moderators for our program tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. So as you all know, we're here to talk about a little-known country that you hardly ever hear about in the news, or at least the current administration wishes that were so. But in all seriousness, we think it's important to place the very tangled web of today's headlines into a broader historical context that takes into account Russia's relations with its neighbors, the US, and the world. Of course, its relations with the US in particular have always been incredibly complicated, from the rise of socialism after the revolution, to the mutual mistrust of the Cold War, to Obama's faulty 2009 reset, to the current allegations of Russian interference in the US elections and possible collusion between Trump officials and Moscow. Whatever happens with the various investigations currently underway, the cloud of suspicion hanging over Trump is sure to dog his administration for months to come, if not the bulk of his presidency. At a minimum, these scandals will have temporarily derailed Trump's often stated promise to work more closely with Russian President Vladimir Putin on areas such as defeating the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. While the House is still debating the Senate-passed bill to tighten sanctions on Russia, it's clear that Congress, and especially GOP hawks, will act to limit the president's maneuvering room when it comes to any sort of rapprochement with Russia. But the current political tug-of-war only tells part of the story. And to get to the bigger picture, we need to take a long lens perspective that looks at defining moments in Russia's history, notably, of course, the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. The psychological wounds from the collapse of communism and its chaotic aftermath have fed widespread resentment among Russians of the West and its economic prescription of shock therapy. At the same time, the disintegration of the Soviet Union bred an entire generation of oligarchs and an economy stunted by corruption, a lack of innovation, and an over-reliance on oil. It also fueled the rise of Vladimir Putin himself, as Tony mentioned, a former KGB officer who has been in power one way or another for the last 17 years. Some historians say this perceived humiliation drives Putin's determination to reassert Russian power on the world stage. Those efforts are perhaps most visible in Ukraine and Syria, which have become hotly contested battlefields for Russia. Yet in fighting to preserve Russia's geostrategic influence in both countries, Putin has also alienated himself from much of the West and, ironically, to a degree, re-energized NATO, the military alliance he's long accused of encroaching on Russia's backyard. While Putin's provocations abroad and repression at home have drawn widespread criticism, he still retains a strong base of domestic support for dramatically improving standards of living over the last 17 years on the back of a major commodities boom. At the same time, Russia's progress is very mixed. Oil prices have crashed, sanctions have taken their toll, there is growing political discontent, including among the middle class and young people, and much of the support that Putin derives from is underpinned by a hard-right nationalist sentiment that often whitewashes the brutal realities of communism. Wading into this very complicated landscape is no easy task for any American policymaker. But we're fortunate today to have a panel that's well-versed in the nuances of this fraught history and what it means for Russian relations today. So on that note, we're going to go ahead and just dive in. And Jeffrey, I'd like to begin with you. You've written quite a bit about great power politics and Russian policy since the end of the Cold War. To what degree do you think that the defeat of the Soviet Union drives Putin's desire to reclaim Russian global prominence? And likewise, does this resentment among Russians account for the enduring support he's enjoyed at home, regardless of some of the more controversial decisions he's made, such as involving Russia in Syria's civil war?
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for the question. It's great to see so many people come out on a random Tuesday night to talk about Russia. I think that's testimony to how central Russia has once again become to policy debates here in Washington. To answer your question about the legacy of the Soviet collapse, I would say, well, it's complicated. Because on the one hand, there's very clearly a politics of resentment at work. And Putin, in playing to that politics of resentment, has tapped into something that seems to have quite deep and quite broad purchase among the Russian population. But I would argue that it's not the end of the Cold War per se that really is at the heart of that resentment. It's the loss of status that came not so much with the end of the Cold War as with the collapse of the Soviet Union and then the failure to integrate Russia into the global, or at least the Euro-Atlantic order that was being constructed at the end of the Cold War. The Cold War, after all, was ended peacefully through the cooperation of the United States and the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Soviet premier, was probably the person most instrumental in bringing about the end of the Cold War, while the Soviet Union still existed. And in that sense, I think you talk to a lot of Russians about this, and they'll say that the United States didn't win the Cold War. What happened was that the leadership of the United States and the Soviet Union collaborated to bring this destructive confrontation to an end, peacefully and collaboratively. What happened, though, was that this method of ending the Cold War bred expectations among Soviet and then Russian elites that Russia would continue to be a partner, that it would continue to enjoy something akin to the status that it had as the rival superpower to the United States. But if the Cold War came to a negotiated end in 1989, 1990, you can pick a different date for when it happened. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Russia, in the aftermath, endured a very severe economic contraction, more severe than the Great Depression in this country. It saw the loss of its peripheral territories as the 14 non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union declared their independence, as the Warsaw Pact countries that had been satellites of the Soviet Union broke away and accelerated their path into Euro-Atlantic institutions like the EU and NATO. There was a hope, at least initially, that Russia could follow this path as well, that it would go from being the core of an alternative block of powers, as it had been during the Cold War, into being an integral part of an economic and security system that encompassed both sides of the Atlantic, that stretched from Vancouver to Vladivostok, as they said. That didn't happen for a variety of reasons, some of them intrinsic to Russia, the collapse of its economy, its failure to completely follow the path of liberalization and democratic transition. Some of it had to do with policy decisions that were made in the West about prioritizing the extension of Euro-Atlantic institutions, above all NATO, to bring in Russia's neighbors while keeping Russia on the outside. That's been a very controversial decision on both sides of the Atlantic, both then and since. My own view is that it was the right decision, but it was one that carried certain costs in terms of the parameters for the future of the relationship with Russia. But at the same time, Russia ended up on the outside of all of these institutions that were being built to manage Euro-Atlantic and European cooperation and security. And as a result, many Russians felt that their country was being sidelined, that it no longer had the clout that the Soviet Union did, and that when the United States and its allies took actions, for example, the bombing of Serbia in 1999 over the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, which Russia opposed, that suddenly Russia didn't count anymore, that nobody took Russia seriously, that the United States and its allies were willing to disregard Russian concerns in a way that they never would have been during the Cold War. Over the course of the next decade, the Russian economy grew quite substantially on the back of rising oil prices, and this was the period when Vladimir Putin was in his first and second terms as Russia's president. And the growing living standards that most Russians experienced contributed to a sense of newfound expectation, I suppose, but it also underpinned Putin's popularity. And it allowed him to demand that Russia be restored to the kind of status that it had as a global player during the Cold War, and which he argued the United States and its allies had denied. This process of the quest for status bred a number of fairly serious confrontations between the United States and its allies on the one hand and Russia on the other. Notably in Georgia in 2008, more recently in Ukraine, where I would argue that Russia under Putin has essentially said, we're not going to let the West push us around anymore. We have gone through a decade and a half of economic growth, some of that quite large, quite significant economic growth. Much of the profits from that growth have been channeled into restoring the capabilities of the Russian military. And moreover, the decisions that the US and its allies have taken have not been in keeping with the idea that Russia is a partner, but rather have looked like a continuation of the containment policy that the US and its allies pursued during the Cold War. Now, whether this is true or not, of course, is a very contentious issue, but this, I would argue, is the Russian narrative. And so with a more powerful military, domestic political consolidation, and a belief that the US and its allies have backed themselves into a corner economically and politically, I would argue Russia has, over the past decade or so, shown itself much more willing to actively push back in areas where it believes the West has challenged its interests, including, as we've seen, through the use of military force. And that use of force has allowed Russia to demand that the US and its allies and others take Russia into consideration, that Russia has to have a seat at the table, whether the question is on the future of Ukraine, the future of Syria, or the nature of the European security architecture. And in that, Russia has been generally successful, sometimes at a high cost, but as Anna just mentioned, we can't ignore Russia. Russia is central to a lot of the major questions of peace and security that the US is dealing with today. And for that reason, Putin remains popular despite the slowing of economic growth, despite the trade-offs that Russian citizens have had to endure in terms of the restrictions on democratic freedoms and the lack of institutionalization of democratic norms in Russia. Nevertheless, there's a sense of pride that Russia is back, that Russia continues to matter, and that once again, the US and other countries in Europe and in Asia have to take Russia seriously. And I think that's a reality that we're all going to be dealing with for some time.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I definitely want to go back to, obviously, the unrealized expectations of the post-Cold War period. But switching gears a bit and to follow up on what you talked about, certainly Putin has a very strong base of support, but at the same time, what we've seen recently is a resurgence of protests throughout Russia. Tens of thousands of people have come out in the largest wave of demonstrations since 2012, largely driven by complaints about corruption, accountability, and local issues such as the demolition of apartments. These protests have resulted in the arrests of hundreds of people. And I'm wondering, William, if you could talk a bit, do you see this simmering discontent gaining steam and becoming some sort of tipping point ahead of the March 2018 elections, or does the opposition remain really too weak and fragmented to ever challenge Putin?
Well, we're in the business of trying to identify these tipping points, and we always like to think that they're coming, but we're usually disappointed for a variety of reasons, and I think in this instance, we're not at a tipping point. And we're not at a tipping point for a variety of reasons. One, after a devastating recession of 2.5 years, you can begin to see some sort of stability in the economy. Small signs of economic growth, return of the foreign reserves, inflation is down, Russia's international debt is not so high. You really begin to see a country that has emerged from a recession and is beginning to recover. Fits and starts, but nevertheless, an outline of a recovery is there. In terms of challenges, Putin really doesn't have any political challenge at the present time. Indeed, his great insight and success is to always make sure that there are no political challengers on the horizon. In that sense, he's learned his crucial lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that is, if you're president, you don't create a Yeltsin. If you're President Gorbachev, you don't create a Yeltsin who actually gets elected and can serve as an alternative source of power. Putin has been very adept and clever and forceful when dealing with the opposition, and there really is no opposition. So there's every expectation, although he hasn't officially announced that, yes, he will run for re-election in 2018. Sorry, I'm busy celebrating an anniversary year this year, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So I'm mixing my centuries up now and again. But there's every expectation that he's going to run, that he will win. He will win with a huge polarity of 60, most likely 70%, because that's what he wants. And usually when Putin wants 70%, he's able to get 70%. So I have every expectation that he will still be around for the foreseeable future as the undisputed leader of Russia. That being said, for someone who seems to have such a strong power base, he is very concerned about any signs that there might be a challenge to his power. And we see that in these protests, for example, most notably in the fight about corruption, where there has been some very large demonstrations, spontaneous and organized. And Putin has been very careful in terms of making sure that they don't seize the political high road in these demonstrations. Part of that is putting Navalny in jail, but also is to kind of lecture to these demonstrators. And he's done so now on several occasions. That it's fine to criticize, but don't make this a political issue. Don't make this, don't form a movement around corruption. Because if you do, I will interfere and make sure that it doesn't create a rival political movement. And indeed, what Putin has done is that he has very selectively charged different government officials with various charges of corruption, none of which have really gone to a major trial yet. But he's trying to show that the state is, in fact, addressing the issue of corruption, and that any sort of spontaneous political movement isn't necessary. So he's trying to stay ahead of the corruption issue, but it is one that can still come back and challenge him. And I think we've seen that in light of the demonstrations that have occurred not only in Moscow, but throughout Russia. So Putin really doesn't have a challenge, I think. I think the last thing I'll say is Putin's greatest challenge is, what is he going to do? He's quite clear he wants to be reelected. And he now has had a parade of a variety of different programs and people come in front of him. They're drafting plans as to what to do in 2018. The former finance minister, Alexei Kudrin, has a plan. A aptly named Stolypin Club has a plan. The government has a plan. There are all these different strategies in terms of what Putin might want to do. But each of them has a huge cost. So that the Kudrin plan essentially means a sharp reduction in the number of bureaucrats, a free and open, a more transparent legal system, a return to kind of general rules of governance and so forth. And that's not what Putin is all about. So he's not very anxious necessarily to undermine his so-called power vertical or the very people that keep him in power. So it's kind of unlikely that he's going to turn to Mr. Kudrin. The Stolypin Club, alternatively, for all those who still believe in stimulus plans, has strongly advocated for a very big stimulus plan and to spend money across the board in order to revive the economy. And Putin never has been willing to introduce a stimulus plan. Indeed, his great success in handling the last economic crisis was he just let the ruble collapse, and he let the people have to suffer, and let the people have to react to the economic crisis. He didn't invest any money. He didn't throw any money at this crisis, even though he has reserves in hundreds of billions of dollars. So one doesn't really anticipate that he's going to listen to either of these strategies. And in fact, the real point is just to stay in power. And that's what I anticipate to happen in the aftermath of the 2018 elections.
I think most pollsters would, at least for now, agree with you on that one. But on the topic of corruption, Hannah, I'd like to talk a bit on another country where that issue is front and center, which is Ukraine, whose president was in town today. Many foreign policy realists point out that Ukraine, country 45 million, is far more geostrategically important to Russia than it is to Europe. Not only is it home to Russia's critical Black Sea Fleet, but Ukraine and Russia both share very deep historical and cultural ties. Crimea, in fact, was itself gifted to Ukraine by the Soviets in 1954 in what many Russians still view as a historical mistake. Hannah, can you talk, to what degree did the EU perhaps misjudge the fact that courting Ukraine would be a red line for Putin? And then on the flip side, to what degree did Putin misjudge the backlash that annexing Crimea would spark? Because after all, the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, though they remain unpopular in certain EU countries, remain in place to this day.
Sure. So I'll try and put this in a somewhat larger context, because this question, I think, is very, very broad, and it plays into some of the things that both Jeff and Will have talked about. So I think I'll start just with a quick outline of where the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine started. I think most people in the U.S. have sort of, and really in Europe throughout the world, have lost sight of the fact that there is still an active conflict in eastern Ukraine. People continue to die daily. There are hundreds of thousands, over 1.5 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, in Ukraine, as well as refugees who have left the country and gone throughout Europe, into Russia, Turkey, and elsewhere. This really started when, as you alluded to, President Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine made a campaign promise to the people of Ukraine. They wanted to have an association agreement with the European Union. That doesn't mean membership in the EU. It means moving towards better standards for business. It means moving towards the same kind of standards that you and I have for the production of dairy products or of canned tomatoes and things of that sort. It represented to the people of Ukraine a kind of slow movement towards progress and towards the future. And when he went back on that agreement in November of 2012, just trying to make sure I get my years right, when he went back on that agreement and decided to not sign the association agreement with the European Union, it started a full protest movement in Ukraine, the kind of thing that Vladimir Putin is now very afraid of happening in Russia itself. And it started a protest movement of Ukrainians who were tired of having their country stolen from them, of Ukrainians who wanted a normal European future where they could take normal vacations and send their kids to universities, where they didn't have to pay bribes, where they didn't have to pay someone off every time they were stopped by a traffic cop, where they didn't have to live in constant fear of having their business taken from them because someone else richer and more powerful wanted it. It was essentially what the Ukrainians like to call a revolution of dignity, a kind of revolution against corruption and against the kind of kleptocracy that they lived in, and the kind of kleptocracy in which, frankly, their Russian friends and neighbors and family members live. And, you know, this is where there has emerged a kind of debate over, well, does Ukraine belong in Russia's sphere? Does it belong in the West sphere? And people throw around all the historical arguments they want, but I think the answer that we keep forgetting about is that it's actually the Ukrainian people's choice. This is a nation of 45 million people who does have a choice and a will of its own, and though there may be various forces trying to push and pull the country one way or the other, at the end of the day, Ukraine does have to make up its own mind, and Vladimir Putin and Russia cannot make it up for them, nor should they, frankly, be allowed to. Now, did the EU misjudge? Potentially, but when you go back and look at the negotiations, there was very little indication from Russia that Russia was upset about it. After all, it's not EU membership, it's not NATO membership, that's not even being discussed. What they were talking about was improving standards. The other option was for Ukraine to join what's called the Eurasian Economic Union. And there, Ukraine would have had to move towards Russian economic and production standards, which are lower than European ones. And while Russia may currently be the largest market for Ukrainian goods, or at least was before the war started, it opened up a debate in Ukraine about which way the country wanted to move. And strictly from an economic standpoint, Europe is a far better market for their goods and products than Russia was. And so I think it's very interesting, this area around Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic countries. A lot of them look at the situation and what's happened in Georgia, in 2008, what happened in Ukraine in 2013, 14, 15, they look at it as a kind of revitalized Russian empire. They don't necessarily see modern Russia, they don't necessarily see the Soviet Union, but they see a kind of upset old Russian empire who wants to take its subjects back. And, you know, it's interesting when you go to Kiev, people often say something like, Vladimir Putin is the father of modern Ukraine. Why? It sounds counterintuitive, but he was the one who really unified them around some common cause. When Ukraine had Crimea annexed from it, when Ukraine was attacked in the east, it acted actually as a coalescing mechanism within Ukrainian society that for the first time really turned Ukraine against Russia. It actually, in a way, I think had the opposite effect that Vladimir Putin thought that it would have. So I do think that he miscalculated in believing that Russians and Ukrainians are identical. Ukraine does have a separate history. Ukraine does have a separate civil society that's far more active and more vibrant than Russian civil society. And he really underestimated the way that Ukraine would react. They weren't welcomed with open arms, and they weren't taken in with love and care. In fact, it was the opposite. Ukrainians proved themselves willing to fight back. They proved themselves angry at the idea that they should be considered someone's little brother, that they should be considered part of someone else's world, when really they wanted to make up their own minds for themselves. There's plenty of other things I think we can go into here, but I'll stop there so we can have time for more questions.
Well, on the subject of spheres of influences, which always comes up, I wanted to talk a little bit about NATO. For years, obviously, Putin has slammed what he sees as a constant wave of NATO expansionism, including the addition of 7 former communist states in 2004, as well as efforts to pull Georgia and Ukraine into quote-unquote NATO's orbit. More recently, Russia has stepped up its provocations in Eastern Europe. It is modernizing its military, and I doubt it's completely unhappy with the growing transatlantic rift under Donald Trump. At the same time, Russia's military remains a tiny fraction of NATO's overall military expenditures. The security alliance has stepped up deployments in Poland and the Baltics, and recently accepted Montenegro as its newest member. I'm wondering, and anybody can feel free to chime in, if we could talk a little bit about this history of suspicion toward NATO, and also more specifically, whether NATO's increased presence along its eastern flank is a justified reaction to Russian aggression or a needless provocation.
Okay, so a little bit about the history, I suppose, and then we can come to the more contemporary issues. NATO, of course, was founded in the 1940s as an element of containment. In the words of NATO's first Secretary General, it was designed to keep from Europe the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And it did that spectacularly for the 40-plus years of the Cold War. That is, it provided a deterrent that kept Soviet forces from attacking the much smaller NATO alliance members in Western Europe. It anchored the United States into the transatlantic community by making the U.S. the guarantor of European security. And it provided an alternative to Germany's remilitarization, which of course had spectacularly bad effects on 3 occasions between 1870 and 1945. When the Cold War ended, the Soviet bloc, which was organized around what was called the Warsaw Pact, collapsed, and NATO continued to exist. And for a lot of people in Russia, this didn't make sense. If NATO's goal was to contain the Soviet Union, was to defend Western Europe from Soviet attack, in the post-Cold War world, that wasn't relevant anymore. The Warsaw Pact, which was the alternative bloc that was facing off across the Fulda Gap from NATO, had ceased to exist. So why did NATO continue to exist? there had been some discussion in the early 1990s about creating a pan-European security architecture. And in fact, there was an organization called the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was founded around, I think, 1991 or 1992. Which encompassed all of the NATO members, all of the former Warsaw Pact members, and all of the countries of the former Soviet Union. Many in Russia saw this as the kernel for some much larger security community that even if NATO continued to exist, would increasingly come to displace NATO, that all of these big questions about security in Europe would henceforth be decided by this wider community, this wider organization. But of course, that's not what happened. What happened is that NATO continued to exist, the OSCE became increasingly marginalized, and NATO expanded. It expanded to take in first Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1997, I think. Yeah. And then it subsequently expanded several more times, and now has 29 members, the most recent of which is Montenegro. Russia continues to see NATO as an institution designed for containment of Russian power. The piece about keeping the Germans down maybe isn't so relevant anymore, but certainly keeping the Americans in Europe and keeping the Russians out of Europe is how many Russians continue to look at the organization. Of course, at least until the outbreak of the crisis in Ukraine, I think we tended to look at NATO in different terms. It was a way of maintaining the transatlantic alliance, of ensuring the United States investment in European security. It was a way of sharing the burden among allies, an issue that's become more salient recently. And it was a way to encourage the post-communist states of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union to follow the path of political and economic reform, because their ability to qualify for membership in NATO, as well as the European Union, depended on their success in implementing a whole series of reforms. It was the carrot, if you will, to get these countries to make difficult political decisions. And I think we, for a long time, tended to look at NATO primarily in that light, that it was a tool for promoting democratic transitions in post-communist countries, which led to the systematic underinvestment in deterrence capabilities. Of course, NATO also became more of an expeditionary force when it got involved in the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and in peacekeeping in other parts of the world, in Libya and the like, which Russia didn't like either for reasons that we can talk about. But the deterrent component actually became much less salient. So it's ironic that Russia continued to regard that as the reason that it was concerned about NATO. And then, of course, when NATO started talking about taking in countries not only that had been part of the Warsaw Pact, like Hungary and Poland, but taking in countries that had been part of the Soviet Union itself, like Ukraine and Georgia, this became a much more sensitive issue in Moscow, especially because, as I talked about previously, Russia in the late 2000s, around 2010, was not the same Russia as it was in 1994 when we were first having these conversations about NATO expansion. And so Russia reacted very strongly to the idea that NATO was now going to take in countries like Georgia and Ukraine. But, you know, Hannah is right that by acting aggressively against countries that sought NATO membership, Georgia in the first instance and then Ukraine more recently, what Russia has done is created this backlash, both within these countries and within NATO itself. So that now this idea of deterrence is much more front and center in terms of what NATO does. Strategic planners, politicians in most countries talk about NATO today primarily as a tool for deterring Russian aggression against Europe, much as it was during the Cold War. Of course, now the front line has moved from the Fulda Gap in Germany to the Suwalki Gap in Poland and Lithuania. So the border has moved east, but now it's also right on Russia's border, which means that Russia is capable of deploying significant numbers of forces into that border territory very, very quickly. And so the most recent decision that NATO took at its Warsaw summit last year to deploy small numbers of rotational forces into the frontline states in Poland, and the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, was designed to deal with this vulnerability. Now, the numbers of forces who are going to be deployed is comparatively small. It's a little bit upwards of 1,000 soldiers in each of those 4 countries. But what matters, I think, is one, that these forces are actually there and that they're multinational. It shows that NATO as a whole is committed to the defense of these countries. And the fact that it's comparatively small, that we're only talking about a little bit more than 4,000 troops in total, means that it's not in and of itself provocative. These forces are not sufficient to launch a surprise military strike against Russia. I think there are those in the Russian government and the Russian commentariat who like to argue that this is a provocative step because it's militarizing the frontier, because it raises the likelihood of a surprise attack. But given the disparity in the numbers of forces that NATO is able to muster and the numbers that Russia would be able to muster on its own side of the border, which number in the tens of thousands under normal circumstances and can be reinforced to a much larger number quite quickly, I don't think that argument actually holds water in terms of just the general military balance.
Jeff, if I can just add one thing, I think it is also really important to note that, in the early and mid-90s when NATO expansion was taking place, it was actually largely driven by the desires of these Central and Eastern European countries. There was a lot of debate in the West about whether or not it should even go through, but the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs put a lot of time and energy into trying to push themselves forward, in part largely for historical reasons, because they had spent so much time as entities having been occupied by either the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. They had a much longer term, I think, historical view on things and saw NATO through their lens, a lens that we certainly were not looking through. They saw NATO as defense against any future Russian aggression that may happen in 10, 20, 15, 100 years.
Yeah, I think that's right.
William?
I just want to add one more point, and that was the question started with, does Russia wants to protect a sphere of influence? And the question really is, how can Russia actually develop a sphere of influence amongst what it perceives as its post-Soviet, amongst the near abroad, the post-Soviet space? And as we've talked, and Jeff and Hannah have mentioned, the Ukraine crisis was brought about because of this great dispute about the creating of a Eurasian Economic Union and incorporating the former Soviet republics into a common economic space. The fact that Ukraine is not part of that significantly undermines Russia's ability to maintain this sphere of influence. And the Eurasian Economic Union itself is really not living up to expectations in terms of trade amongst each other, the enforcement of sanctions against Ukraine. Ironically, the 2 major partners of the Eurasian Economic Union, Belarus and Kazakhstan, have not enforced the sanctions against Ukraine that Russia has imposed, and therefore has created a significant bypass of those sanctions, and has resulted in Belarus, for a while at least, being the greatest importer of fish products into Russia, even though quite obviously it doesn't border on any major sea at all. But that was just simply one of the means by which the idea was somehow Russia was going to create a sphere of influence amongst the post-Soviet space. But the loss of Ukraine as a result of the conflict and the real failure to for the Eurasian Economic Union to succeed economically, let alone its failure to actually have a larger political goal other than Russia's political goal within it, means that Russia's sphere of influence is not as strong as one might have expected.
Well, there's still a lot to cover, but I'd like to open the floor up to questions.
I wanted to ask about the situation of the Russian-speaking minorities in places like Ukraine and the Baltic states. And I understand that during the crisis in the Ukraine, when the Ukrainian prime minister or president left the country and the new parliament kind of took over, they declared that the Russian language would no longer be a official second language in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if this provoked the Russian reaction. And I also remember that Henry Kissinger at one point had said that the big mistake in our policies was that we tried to make Ukraine part of the West, EU and NATO perhaps, and what it should have been is just set up as a bridge state between the West and the East.
So I think, so Howard, it's a very interesting question. I think that law that you're talking about that was passed was actually, as I recall it, the repeal of a law that had been put into place by the Yanukovych government, and it was extremely ill-timed and extremely ill-advised and never actually happened. It was vetoed. It was, though, the very idea of that law used as a kind of excuse for the annexation of Crimea, which was a majority Russian-speaking area, for what then later happened in the eastern part of the country, the Donbass region. But I think one of the very practical realities that people miss about Ukraine is that it is a 100% bilingual country. Nearly every single person in Ukraine speaks both Russian and Ukrainian. It does not really matter, and frankly, I'd say about 70% of the country, I might be over-exaggerating a little bit, speaks a kind of weird, mixed-up language that's a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian, and it's called Surjik. And they blend them without even knowing that they're doing it. I lived in Ukraine for 2 years, and I learned Russian and Ukrainian. It is just how people get by, and there's not generally discrimination based on what your language is. The language laws, I think, have been far more contentious than people's everyday lives are. The laws that have gone sort of back and forth, should we, when we show Russian language soap operas from Russia, should we dub them in Ukrainian, or should we just put subtitles in Ukrainian? There's lots of little arguments like that. When it comes to movies, when it comes to music, what should be there and what is the official policy of Ukraine? And those policies go back and forth, but the reality is that nearly everyone is bilingual. Those who aren't officially bilingual can get by in either language. I think the situation is for Russian-speaking or Russian ethnic minorities is actually a little bit different in the Baltics, where it's a much clearer line. Ukrainian and Russian are very similar languages. That's why I managed to learn them both. They're both in the same language family, sort of like Spanish and Portuguese. Latvian and Russian are extremely different. They use a different alphabet. They are from totally different linguistic families. Estonian and Russian are even more different. And so in those countries, Latvia and Estonia in particular, where the Russian ethnic minority is clearly very different than the Estonian ethnic majority, there have been some different tensions based around the question of whether or not the ethnic Russians will learn Estonian. So you essentially can't become an Estonian, Latvian citizen. I'm hopefully not getting all the legal details right. But in order to become a citizen, you have to pass a Latvian or Estonian language test, which many of the ethnic Russians either don't want to do, can't do because they're 70 years old and it's impossible to learn a very, very difficult language like Estonian, or they just refuse to do it. And so it's become a big problem for those countries, but at the same time, because they're part of the European Union, a lot of the ethnic Russians who live in Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania doesn't necessarily have the same problem. It's only about 5 or 6% ethnic Russians living in Lithuania. They tend to have higher salaries, better life, and they talk to their family members back in Russia. And there's generally a feeling that slowly we'll assimilate, and slowly that is what has been happening, where Latvia is now producing children's shows in Russian language, and things are starting to move in the right direction. But it's a long and slow process, and I think requires political will from both sides. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, question. Is there any shred of democracy left in Russia, apart from economic freedoms that are enhanced versus the Soviet Union? I don't feel like the Western media sometimes focuses enough on that there's really not, under Putin, it's basically back to a a sham democracy, dictatorship situation? What's your take on that?
Well, there are elections, and it's actually very interesting to always watch elections because they do tell you a lot about how people are thinking inside Russia, even if the result is often predetermined. That being the case, there aren't free and fair elections, obviously, in terms of how we understand them. And there are various ways by which the state and Putin is able to put obstacles in the way of having these types of free and fair elections. Part of it, for example, is to create a high threshold by which one can enter the parliament based on proportional representation. That keeps a lot of the smaller pro-democratic parties out of the Duma. Another way that Putin has done this is by allowing to have regional elections of governors, but creating this incredibly confusing filter, as what it's referred to, by which you have to get signatures of certain numbers of representatives in parliament, in the local legislatures, in order to get yourself on the ballot as a governor. And since the local parliamentarians are controlled by Putin's party, it's very unlikely that they're going to let an opposition politician run against them. That being the case, there are examples of unexpected results. There are examples of competitive elections. There are going to be gubernatorial elections in September, and according to latest prognostications, 3 out of 16 might be competitive. So that's something. I think the final thing I'll say, even in the most recent Duma elections, you learned a lot about the state of democracy by the people who chose not to vote. And what you learned is that in the major cities, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, a large proportion of the population simply chose not to vote. And that's usually not a way to get the result that you want. But it showed in its own way Putin's vulnerabilities, that he's not necessarily in charge of the major urban population centers, and that could pose a problem at some point in the future.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I believe Stephanie has a few concluding remarks.
I'll just say, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C., thank you all for sharing your time and expertise with us this evening. Please join me.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.